Shout out Big Sam Presents with a Z. Mad respect for the veterans. And you're damn right. Keep it diverse until they get triggered. $15. Little man. Put that shit in my hand. From New York to Japan. Stay with the band. Shout out. Keep listening to Big Sam's. Rah!
Big Sam presents Raw. It's Big Sam presents Raw. It's Big Sam presents Raw.
I make this for you.
Big Sam presents Raw.
I make this for you.
Big Sam presents Raw.
I make this for you.
Big Sam presents Raw.
I make this for you.
Big Sam presents Raw.
I make this for you.
Big Sam presents Raw.
I make this for you.
Did you know Big Sam Presents is available on iHeartRadio? That's right, you can put iHeartRadio in your internet browser and or download the app and look up Big Sam Presents with the Z at the end of Presents, and you will be able to listen to my podcast, now available streaming on iHeartRadio. Take your ass to iHeartRadio and subscribe to my damn podcast. I appreciate you, baby.
I make this for you.
It's Big Sam presents Raw.
Hi, would you like to sponsor this show? You have the ability to sponsor Big Sam Presents Raw and or Shit Talk. I don't give a goddamn. You could pay me $100 a month or $50 a week or $250 every 2 weeks. Regardless. It don't even matter. If you want to sponsor this show, you can. Let me know. I'm Big Sam, and you got the opportunity to sponsor this show. This show, goddammit, this one. Are you not entertained? Fuck you, because I wasn't trying to entertain you. Bye, bitches.
Something very close to my heart. And I'm not here to be divisive. I'm not here to offend anyone. I'm here to speak to you as Geronimo talked to a general in the 1880s in the mountains not too far from here, when he met with him at a peace conference, a powwow, and said to him, he said, this morning, he said, I want to speak to you the truth. And I want the truth to be like arrows that go out from my heart and my soul to your mind and your body. And I want each and every one of you to understand what I'm talking about this morning. You see, I'm very profoundly disturbed. I just left Tuskegee, where black folk are suffering. And I'm very disturbed when I go across this country, and I cannot find the sensitivities and the concerns about black folk in America that I want to see. And the only minister that I have seen and heard from any place in this nation has been Dr. Price, that is telling you what you should be listening to. And I've spoken all over this country and all over the world representing presidents and governors. And he is the only minister I've run into so far that violate all the social norms that were exacted on black folk back in the 1790s as this country began to move into an evangelical movement. And they decided in the 1790s that it is now permissible to have a black preacher or to have black folk invest themselves into a religious experience. And the establishment in this country says, yes, we will let blacks have their own separate services, but we must pick the minister. We must pick a minister that is controllable. And we must tell him exactly what he's supposed to do, we will license the ministers. So by the 1720s, the entire establishment in this country has set up a system saying that any black minister in this country, he has an admonishment. He must teach black folk three things so that religion will become a control device to help us maintain the status quo on black folk in this country. He says every black minister who we select or we license, they must teach black folk. First of all, when you talk about the Bible, you talk about the master and the slave, you are talking about the white master on earth and the black slave. You must secondly teach black folk to be humble and obedient and accept their life lot, and to be respectful and loyal to the white servant, to the white master. And lastly, you must teach black folk. You must teach black folk that they will get theirs in the hereafter, in pie in the sky. And that went into effect in the 1820s, and every black minister fell in the line and did it. And they stayed like that until after the Civil War, when 119 blacks on October the 19th walked into St. Paul's Church, Baptist Church in Raleigh, North Carolina, and says, we can't take it anymore. As black folk, the suffering is too acute. And said we must at least have 40 acres and a mule or something. You cannot just turn us loose, free, and say we're free, and give us non-economic emancipation where we are pennilessly, poor, impoverished, sick, broken, busted, uneducated, ignorant, homeless, nothing, and say we are now free. And that is the only minister, Dr. Price, that I've heard that understands that you got an obligation in the ministry to go above and beyond that admonishment put on black folk over 150 years ago. Now, in this area, maybe some of them don't like it. I don't care. I'd learned to respect a man at distance, and I fell in love with him last night at dinner. And if I can ever be of any help to him in what he's trying to do, he's got my help and my institute's help. And so this morning, in the time that's been allotted to me, I want to talk to you, as I said, like Geronimo, but I want to be like the great European philosopher Diogenes, who walked through life with a lantern in his hand, saying, I want to lighten the darkness because I'm in search of an honest man. But like Diogenes, I want to walk through this temple and through black America with a new movement I'm trying to create. I want to find not necessarily an honest man. I want to find some black people and some white people that understand the problems in America. I want to find somebody that understands in America that contrary to popular myths, black folk are not progressing in America. Black people are going backwards. In comparative proportional terms, black people in America, where you were in 1850 in this country, you have not progressed. You're still in your same dilemma, contrary to anybody tells you. And you see, I want to find, like Diogenes, I want to find a black person that understands that black folk are not progressing. But more importantly, I want to find somebody, black or white, that don't mind being black and want to talk about the racial problem in this society. I can't even find that with my lantern in life. We got 3 or 4 major black organizations in America. 3. The Urban League, NAACP, the Rainbow Coalition, and one other one. I can't even get them to focus on the issue of black folk. One wants to take care of cultural diversity. One wants to be talking about multiculturalism. One wants to talk about minority issues. The other wants to talk about oppressed people. And I asked them across the country, why don't somebody talk about black folk and the problems of black people? And so I'm looking, like Diogenes, for a person that understands the history of this country, because I want to understand the problem in America. And the problem is not what you all have been taught. The problem is not poverty. It is not unemployment. It is not unwed teenage parents. It is not food stamps. It's not public housing. It is not drug abuse. Black people only got 2 problems in America. The first problem is that you've been systematically locked into the lowest level of a real-life monopoly game. That's your major problem. And that's what Dr. Price directly and indirectly is telling you about every Sunday morning. You have been locked into a no-win situation. That means that all the wealth and power in this country has been skewed over 400 years systematically into the hands of the majority white society. Black people don't own a significant amount of anything to be able to control their lives. Whites in America right now control almost 100% of all the income, the wealth, the power, the resources, the businesses, the privileges, and all levels of government. You cannot compete. And I'm tired of hearing people telling black folk, why don't you compete? Compete with what? What are you going to compete with? They keep saying, well, black folk can run fast and jump higher. That won't make it. It won't make it. And let me tell you what monopoly is. Monopoly means that all the wealth and power has been skewed based on skin color, going white, yellow, brown, black. And if you've never played the game of Monopoly, let me show you how it's played. I play it every year at my family. It means that everybody, when you sit down, you're given a certain amount of money and wealth. Black people never got their 40 acres and a mule. Now we're playing this game of Monopoly. And let's pretend for a second in this auditorium that whites got $1,000 to play the game of Monopoly. Asians got $500. Hispanics got $300. Indian got $100. And blacks got $50 to play the game of Monopoly. Now, never having gotten your 40 acres of mule, you don't own any land. You don't own any land. And if you don't have the money, you can't put any houses and hotels on the land if you got lucky and had some. Now, when you roll the dice in our hypothetical game of Monopoly, and you roll the dice and your number comes up on the wrong piece of property, what happens to you? You must either go bankrupt or go to jail. And that's the monopoly game that black folk are locked into. And when that happens to you in life, when you only got two alternatives in life, to either go bankrupt or go to jail, that is called an underclass. And black people in America are systematically being forced into a permanent underclass. We will be a permanent underclass by the year 2013. And you got about a 2.5-year window left. If we don't do some very specific things and start to come up with some very cogent strategies, comprehensive strategies of doing some things to focus on that number one problem of redistributing the wealth and power back into the hands of black folk, you can hang it up. Don't worry anymore about retiring. After the next 2 or 3 years, don't worry anymore about going to college. It ain't going to work. The doors are going to slam shut on black folk. And what I'm telling you right now is we're going to have to get it together fast. And to do it, you must first understand what I'm going to be telling you this morning. And my speech is going to be divided into 3 parts. I'm first going to tell you about the problems of black America realistically. As Cochise and Geronimo said, I'm going to give you the truth about the current state of black America, point 1. 2, I'm going to analyze it for you. And 3, I'm going to give you the solutions that we can do together to come out of it. Okay? Now, we got a very serious problem in that monopoly game. We're going to have a converging forces, social forces coming across this country. About 8 major forces are going to push us into that understructure, in that underclass position. And let me talk about 3 or 4 of them right quick. First thing, across this country, you're going to have an increasing amount of conservatism. Now, I want you all to understand up front what conservatism means. So I don't care whoever uses that word, you know what it means. Conservatism is a new code word for anti-blackism. Okay? Except now a conservative can stand right in your face and tell you and confess that he's a conservative, which means he is a racist and not tell you he's a racist. Racism, right now, we got racism all over America and I can't find one racist. And what I'm telling you right now, before my book even hit the market, I'd already predicted in my book that you're going to have a cutback in welfare. I predicted in my book they're going to catch people like in Texaco. And they just caught Avis discriminating against blacks in North Carolina, South Carolina. And they just caught Circuit City, Sam's, Walmart's. I knew they were going to try to cut out the single-member districts. I knew they were going to go after affirmative action. I knew there were going to be riots all over this country that are coming. I talked about this a long time ago in the book because that's what conservatism means. Conservatism comes from the root word to conserve. To conserve means to hold on to what you've got, or those who ain't got, as my mother said in a 3rd grade education, you ain't going to get. That's what conservatism means. And it means nothing else. It means maintain the status quo. It means use every device that you have to give the pretense that what you see is normal. And right now there's a conservative move in this country going from the White House across this land through the Congress that says whatever exists all over this nation and in Los Angeles is normal. They want you to believe that it's normal to go out in Los Angeles and see all the drug abuse and all the crime, all the poverty, and all the suffering of black folk lying and sleeping on the streets, drugged out, doped out. They want you to believe that's normal. That's what conservatism means, maintain the status quo. It also means to reinstitute white authority, white values, so you hear them talk about family values and all these other kind of things, and also white superiority. So when people start talking about they want to go back and be a conservative, you ask them, what are you trying to conserve? When my people don't own anything and you own 100%, what have I got to conserve? When you hear blacks going around screaming about they are black conservatives, you ask them, what are you conserving? Tell me one point in history that you found something that you want to conserve. Don't let people run that game on you about being a conservative. You tell them, say, fine, if you want to tell me what are you conserving? And when my people never had anything, why would they want to be a conservative? So the biggest problem we're going to have is conservatism when it goes across this nation. And we as black folk got to understand, now it's not all whites that are conservatives. There is an element that's got everything that want to make that it's the greed over need. They want to hold on to everything. And so, we're going to have a massive flow. Everybody's going to be talking about conservatism. You're going to see people politically switching, talking about they're moving to the far right. And what we have to do is understand that, and that's going to create major problems in this country. One, you're going to, not only will you see an increasing amount of negative hostility towards black folk, every piece of research in the country tells us that, even from the Jewish organizations, that you're going to see more anti-blackness now and in the future than you've ever seen in the last 60 years since you left the civil rights movement. Two, we see organizations all over the country now, paramilitary groups, Aryan groups, vipers, free man, skinhead, baldhead, all kind of groups that are organizing and optimistically expecting and anticipating a major clash in this country between blacks and whites. We've had 28 states in the United States now to pass concealed weapons laws. That's specifically so some of the white contingency groups can carry weapons and arms at all times. That's why you have such a major thrust from the National Rifle Association. That's why they're controlling most of your politicians. That's why you have such a major anti-governmental effort in this country. You hear people say, we want to go back to states' rights. We're anti-government. We want to get rid of the federal government. It's not that they're against government. They know that in history, the only people who've ever saved black folk has been the government, twice, the federal government. And if you eliminate the federal government by downsizing the government, black folk no longer have an ally. And if a clash occurs, you got nobody to come to the rescue a third time to help you. You see, you were pulled out of slavery by the federal government. You were pulled out of Jim Crowism by the federal government. There are contingencies in the country that says the next time there won't be a federal government to pull blacks out. And you hear them talk about their anti-government, that's what they're talking about. They're not against government. And later on you hear me tell about why they're not against government. Because you see, primary wealth in this country, the primary responsibility of government is to move wealth and to move power. And that's how the dominant society got its wealth and its power, by using government. But now they want to make sure black folk don't have access to it. That's why they're anti-affirmative action, but I'll get into all that a little later. But so the biggest thing, one of the biggest things that are going to drive us in this underclass structure will be conservatism. The second thing is that you're going to have an unending influx of immigrants into the country. And that's what Dr. Price is talking about. And nobody, no black politician, no black organization wants to deal with that issue. They will avoid it at all costs, even though in their hearts they know that's one of the biggest problems for black folk. We anticipate in the next 10 to 12 years approximately 8 to 6 million Hispanics coming into the United States and 41 million Asians. You have been the majority minority for 400 years in this country. You have been the number 2 population for 400 years. You're going to get kicked out of being number 2. You're going to go down and become number 4. Now, common sense Even a third grade education would tell you, if you didn't get anything when you were number 2, yeah. You all jumped ahead of me, but anyway, you can guess what you're going to get when you become number 4. And the worst part about it is as you descend and go down to number 4, those other groups are going to go up. And as they go past you, you're going to have major racial clashes in this country. You're going to have fights all over this country between blacks and Hispanics, blacks and Asians, blacks and poor whites. And black folk cannot fight all these groups. Everybody can not always be against black folk. They know that we are vulnerable and we are defenseless. And we cannot fight those groups. Because you see, they didn't come into this country with the legacies that we are stuck with. Everybody in America has an advantaged position but black folk. But all are in a state of denial. The white power structure in a state of denial. They are pretending that everything they got, that 100% control and ownership of everything, they got it because they worked hard through a Protestant ethic. That's not how they got it. And you always hear them say, well, what you got to do, you got to work hard. Nobody can work any harder than a slave. But they're going to keep running these games on black folk. And at the same time, we got black folk that are accepting that what we got to do is work harder. And you see, when we get into that in a few minutes about history, what the power structure really want is what we call unearned income. Slavery was nothing but unearned income for whoever owns the slave. And once slavery ended, that's where Wall Street came from. Wall Street was based on slavery. Everything that blacks were producing went to Wall Street then. And now that all that money that's amassed on Wall Street is still producing unearned income. All that money is producing a regular salary for people. It's in stocks and bonds and dividends. They don't have to work. Never had to work. But we're going to talk about that later on. So what I'm saying now is that you're going to have this massive influx of immigrants into the country that are better equipped. They don't have your legacies. They don't have your disadvantages. They're walking across the border. They're going to get a free lunch. They don't have to pay dues. But you got public policies in this country that are equating them to black folk. They're equating them to black, and what we've allowed them to do, starting in 1970, is to wrap themselves in black folks' suffering and pretend somehow they suffered along with black folk. And therefore, whatever program is created under this misguided label called minority, that they are equal to you and over you. And we're going to deal with that whole concept of minority in a few minutes too. So that's the problem with the influx of immigrants. And what they are doing is coming to the country and doing what we've never been allowed to do and we've never been bright enough to do in some senses, is to build your own communities. You got to build your communities. You see, every group that when they leave their homeland, the last thing they do is look in the mirror. They look in the mirror and say, I'm going to America. And I'm going to go to America. I'm going to find me a community or neighborhood. Or I'm going to build one with people who look like me. And so that's why you go all over this nation, where they're coming out of Asia. You will find Vietnamese towns all over California, little Cambodias. You'll find a Chinatown in every major city. You'll see the Hispanics come in. They'll build a little Mexico, a little Havana, a little Hialeah. You find little Italys, French towns, German town, Greek town, Polish town, but you cannot find one black town. And we are the only people that keep trying to integrate. We are the only people, rather than looking in the mirror and saying, I see somebody that looks like me, I want to go find and build me a community of people who look like me. We are doing just the opposite. That's your second problem, is inappropriate behavior of black folk. We keep looking in the mirror and says, I want to get away from everybody that looks like me. You can't have any power and wealth doing that. If you don't have a community, you cannot rebuild Los Angeles without a black community. If I cannot come in this city, you can tell me where every black lives, where he stays, where he works. You don't have a community. And all of you that want to go in business, don't waste your time. You cannot start a business and operate without a town or a community. Why can't you do it? Because without a community, you have no market. If you don't have a market, every black is going to go by your store at 200 miles an hour heading for the suburbs and heading for the malls. And that's why you got this major displacement of capital out of the black neighborhood. And I tell black folk, if you want to go in business today, don't do it. Give me the money. I need it. Because you're going to go bankrupt. 80% of all black folk that go into business under the present system, you will go bankrupt within 2 years. You will lose your money within 2 years because you don't have a market. And see, that's how the other groups function. They have their own markets, their own communities. And we're going to talk about that a little later on, too. See, the good Reverend Dr. Price, he gave me 2 hours to talk to you all, so I'm going to get to all those points, okay? So we got major problems. That's the second thing, is dealing with this influx of immigrants. And what I'm telling you is that they're not coming in here to be your partner or your ally. They're coming in to compete with you. And your black organization and your black leadership in this country is afraid to teach black folk how to compete with all these other groups. And they're afraid because they keep trying to create allies with them. You cannot ally with anybody who's planning on supplanting you. You see, if you go check the Council of La Raza, you check the Council of Salala, if you check the National Hispanic Defense League, if you check the National Hispanic Party, the first thing that all of them have is to change the issues in this country from white and black to white and Hispanic. They're planning on supplanting you. When the National Hispanic Party started in Miami in 1974, I was in the governor's office there. I was the only black in politics. That was the first item on their agenda, saying by the year 2000, they want to take blacks out of the equation. And that's why, as Dr. Price just said, that's why they control South Florida. They play to win. We play to play. Okay? And when I leave here today, I want you all forevermore in helping Dr. Price to play to win. Okay? The third thing that's going to hurt us and push us into this underclass structure is technology. You got blacks running all over the country telling black folks, some people, well, what we're going to do, we can overcome racism. We get involved in technology. Won't happen. Technology has never been a friend and ally of black folk. It has always been our worst enemy. Why has it been? Because you see, racism has always kept us in our place. And technology has always come along and run over that place. That's why technology has always been our enemy. See, when you keep a black man as the porter, then all of a sudden you come along with a floor sander, he's gone. You keep him as the elevator operator and you put a computer in the elevator. You keep him as a dishwasher and you get an automatic dishwasher. You all understand what I'm telling you? So when black people come to you telling you, well, you get technology, no. You say, no. What we have to do is to get control or get behind technology so to stop running over us. And I got friends in Washington, D.C. going all over this country telling black folk, you got to get into the information highway. And you can overcome racism. Whites were not that dumb. You cannot get on the information highway and overcome racism. Because the information highway is like any other highway. It's a transportation system. And what you should be asking yourself is, what are you transporting? If you don't have anything to transport, you can't get on the information highway. So what we got to be talking about as black folk is owning and controlling. It's just like when they invented the highway, the airplane system, the shipping system, the train system. It didn't advantage black folk because we never owned the trains, the planes, and the ships. What we got to do right now, starting with your church, is try to figure out how we can own and control more. Then the highway makes sense to us. Okay? Now, and that's why right now in Washington, D.C., the Office of Technology's last report says that the people going to be hurt most by technology are going to be black folk. And a fellow named Jeremy Rickman has a book out called The End of Work. And he is the director of the National Economic Trends for Washington, D.C. and nationally. He's the guy that put out these trends. He put a book out. And his book, Chapter 5, talks about what technology is going to do to people. And he uses black folk as an example. And I went and sat down and talked with him. And what he says to Dr. Anderson, he said, my publishers tried to make me take that chapter out of the book. He said, I fought to keep it in. He said, because technology is going to kill black folk. And read that book, and that's what he's talking about. He says, because black folk don't have any control of technology, don't own anything. And that's why we're getting ready to lose all our radio stations in this country. We're going to lose all of our television stations in this country. Because what's happening now, they've lifted the allocation cap, and now it's called social Darwinism, economic Darwinism. Whoever got the most money now can buy anything they want in technology. And so the few black stations we got in the United States now up for grabs. And as a matter of fact, even the cable system is going to be up for grabs because we don't have the money and resources. We can't compete with the whites now who want to buy all the systems. And once that happens, you can't get your information in. Now, that would not happen to organizations, to groups like the Hispanics. Because, see, the Hispanics got smart enough, they built communities. Then they took their language and they built a fence around their communities. They used their culture to protect their communities. Where is your culture in Los Angeles for black folk? Where is your fence? And we're going to talk about that later on. You are vulnerable. The fourth thing that's going to happen to you is that this whole contract with white America is not anti-liberalism. It is not anti-Democratic Party. It wasn't even anti-Clinton. What it was they were trying to answer a question that's been haunting white America for about 30-something years. And that is, what do you do with 36 million obsolete black folk? That's what the contract was for. And how they concluded that was, you see, they got 1,200 white think tanks in America. 1,200 white think tanks. You got one wholly owned black think tank, and that's the Harvest Institute I'm trying to run. They got 3,000 employees with a $500 million budget. I got a few volunteers. No staff, no money. Because you see, in this country, no blacks wants to give my black think tank any money to help our leaders to develop policy and public issues. And when I ask them for money, what they say is that we can't give you money. I said, why not? They said, what is your organization for? I said, to help black America. They said, who's going to benefit? I said, black folk. They said, who's going to work in it? I said, black folk. They said, ooh, too black. And the first thing that comes to my mind is, how can you be too black? What is too black? 10, 20, 30? What's too black? Nobody ever says something is too Jewish, too Indian, too Asian. And I'm telling you, people are telling me this too blackness comes from our black entertainers, our black athletes that's making $100 million. They could give the money to us that they're paying in taxes because we're tax exempt. But they'd rather give it to the government than even give it to an organization to help black folk in this country. Because they don't want to be black. And I keep trying to tell them, it doesn't hurt that much being black. Now, let me move a little fast. I'm talking too slow. I'm going to speed up now, go real fast. You all keep up with me. Now, what's going to happen now, what these think tanks decide to do in the contract with America, they found out through their research that approximately 68 to 7% of all the blacks in America work in some level of government. This happened as a direct result of the civil rights movement. See, at the end of the civil rights movement, instead of moving against the problem to get more wealth and power for black folk, our civil rights organizations pushed us over and looking for jobs. And so all of our black folk then, over 50 to 60% of all the blacks that got jobs after the civil rights movement went into government. So 68 to 70% of all the blacks in America are working either in federal government, city government, state government, county government, libraries, and school systems. So when you hear white folks talking about downsizing government, what they're talking about are de-employing and disemploying black folk. They know that. They know that. So in Washington, D.C., they plan on firing 480,000 people. And what the Office of Management and Budget, right out of the White House, says is that for every white person who gets fired, we're going to fire 2 blacks. Now, if you're only 12.3% of the population, and you're going to fire 2 blacks for every white, you're going to be devastated. Now, let me give you the real picture, even before they started firing black folk. Let me give you the real, true options for black folk. There's only 3 things that you can do in this world as a black person to earn a living and survive. You either must work, go on welfare, or you steal. Now, for those who missed that, let me give it to you again. You either work up here, you go on welfare here, or you steal down there. You're talking about your crime problem. I'll show you how you get into your crime problem. Now, right now at the top level, everybody prefers to work. Now, I just told you that 68 to 70% of all the black folk are working in government. 26 to 28% of the rest of the blacks are working in white corporations. And those white corporations are going to follow the government. They're going to downsize. You're going to see IBM cutting back, Apple Computers, and Meritech, Lucent Tech, now all of them going to cut back. Only 2% of the blacks in America work in their own stores and their own business in their own communities. Only 2% that are not vulnerable. Only 2% of blacks are not vulnerable. The rest are vulnerable in America. Now look at the problem at the top. Now, contrary to what anybody tells you, the unemployment problem in America is not 5.2% you hear every day in the newspapers and read. That is not about black folk. That's about whites. They're only talking about people who are either getting unemployment compensation or looking for jobs. That's how they're getting that figure. The unemployment rate in America for black folk today is 34% nationally. Now, if you want to understand how devastating that is, think for a second. Follow me along. Think about this. When the unemployment rate in America for whites went up to 25% in the 1920s, they called it a depression. Now, the unemployment rate for blacks hasn't even come down to 25%. But when the unemployment rate went up for whites and hit 25%, they used every level of government. They said it's a depression and every piece of machinery, money, anything must be used to bring that unemployment rate down. And now with black unemployment rate, not at 25%, at 34%, nobody cares. They say we can't, that's not the role of government to help with the employment problem. 34% for blacks nationally. Now in Detroit, Michigan, Baltimore, and New York, the unemployment rate is 45%. Don't think that's bad yet. I'm giving you the worst stuff yet. In Pittsburgh, it is 49%. And for black youth in this country, it is 57%. That's why you got your problem out here on the streets. Because nobody wants to give you the true facts about why you got problems. Now that's at the top level. Now when you kick those people out of those jobs in the government and out of those corporations, they must go down to the second level. I'm going to show you how you get into your underclass. You kick them down to the second level. But the conservatives in this country have already made preparation for you when you come down to the second level. That's called welfare. They got prepared. They said, hey, when you come down here, don't plan on staying here. We just had welfare reform, which means you can't stay here on the second floor either. And now to do welfare, actually, you can only be on welfare for 2 years. We're going to kick you off of that, which means you must go down to the next level. But before they kick you off the second level, look at the second level already. The poverty level in America for black folk is 35%. That means 35% of all the black people in this country got a zero, negative, nil, none net worth. That means they own nothing. 35%. 47% of all the black children in America are beneath the poverty level. I just left New Orleans. New Orleans. That's why I had tears in my voice and my eyes a few minutes ago when I talked about leaving New Orleans and Tuskegee University. In New Orleans, the poverty rate there for black folk is 80%. And somebody got to wake up. You can't stand that kind of poverty. Anyhow, I'm sorry. The poverty rate for black youth in this country is 47%. That means they can't even make daily bread. For black female-headed households, it is 52%, with 2 children in the family. And nobody cares. Nobody cares. And so they're going to now have welfare reform to kick them off the second level. So now they must go down to the next level. The next level is crime. Your crime rate in America is going to go straight up within the next 2 and 2.5 years. Straight up. Because, see, black folk are not simply going to disappear, they evaporate. Even if you don't care about them, they're not going to evaporate. Now, let's look at the crime rate already. In the most productive years for a black man in this country, but all these black men in this room, your most productive years are between 20 and 35 years of age. And already, 40% of all the black men in America are either in prison, on parole, or probation. 40%. And black women want to know why they don't have any husbands or fathers to their children. In the state prisons, 47% of your state prisoners are black. 52% of your federal prisoners are black. And 96% of all the prisoners in the United States, all the black prisoners, 96% are black men. And nobody cares. Nobody seems to care. Now, this is not new. Because you see what's going to happen now, you're going to have a new growth industry in this country. The new growth industry is going to be owning, operating, and building prisons and selling services and goods to them. And there are 2 major corporations right now, I won't give you the names, have already set up a big contract to take over some of the monies of it. The government passed what's called the Omnibus Crime Bill for $29 billion to build more prisons in the United States. And 2 big companies have found out they can get $82,000 for every jail cell they build and $27,000 a year to operate the prison per prisoner. And just in all those black prisoners you find, just the black male prisoners, for supplying them with shaving lotion, underarm deodorant, and soap, that is a $3 billion a year industry, and black people don't get a penny out of it. People are already making money off of our people in prison. And nobody even cares about where the money is going and how they're making the extra money, even after they criminalize you. Now, this criminalization process didn't start here, so let me get with the public policy and show where everything started, and let's analyze it with history very quickly. The whole problem goes back to 1619. In 1619, there was no such thing. Y'all be clear on this. There was no such thing, basically, as racism. Racism didn't exist before black slavery started. You had conflicts between ethnic groups. You had conflicts between religious groups. And you had cultural disagreements. But you never had racism until black enslavement started. Racism is a word that means race. It means group. I don't want you to let people keep telling you that black people can be racist. You cannot be racist. The word does not exist for you. Racism means group-based. Racism means a power relationship. A power relationship between 2 groups where one group owns and controls so much that they can use their wealth and their powers to deprive and hurt and injure another group. That's what racism is. And no place can you find a black person on earth that can be a racist. Only thing you can get at best is a black reactionary. That means a black person who's reacting to white racism. And I want people to quit calling Farrakhan a racist. Farrakhan is not a racist. What Farrakhan is doing is reacting to white racism. If black folk had been racist, they'd have been racist 400 years ago. They would have stopped people from depriving and hurting and castrating and lynching and exploiting them 400 years ago. That's why if you go back through history, you cannot find one single solitary instance any place in history on this earth where black folk have had enough power and wealth to come together to do injury to another group and take something from them. In the United States, you've never seen any blacks come together as an organization, as a group, to hurt any other group. Blacks have never done anything to Jews or to whites or anybody else, Asians or Hispanics, as a group. We can't practice racism. We don't even have a community to practice racism. But on the other hand, I can go through history books and I can show you mountains, thousands, maybe millions of instances where everybody else have done things mean to us, to deprive and hurt us, by social customs, by extra legal and legal means, by laws to do in black folk. You can't be a racist unless you got power and wealth for your group to be able to hurt other people and take and do them in, and we don't have it. So all we are reactions to white racism. And so in 1619, when they started bringing blacks into this country, they brought blacks in this country for the very specific reason, initially, as indentured servants. They were sold off a Dutch ship for water and supplies. Blacks did reasonably well in the United States between 1619 and 1920, about 1924, 1925, in that general time frame. They served out their indentureship. Between 1626 and 1638, they began to intermingle with whites. Some of them intermarried, interbred. In 1638, the founding stone for racism in America was laid. The state of Maryland put out the first public edict that started racism for blacks in America. They put out an edict, a public policy called the Doctrine of Exclusion. The Doctrine of Exclusion says that black people should never be permitted to enjoy the fruits of white society. That became the doctrine of racism in America in 1638. Now, that was called a doctrine of exclusion. That meant every time you get a chance, exclude black folk out of it. I don't care what it is, exclude them out. What is out of, nowadays, out of welfare, food stamps, whatever it is, exclude them out. Business, anything you can do. Now, that went on from 1638 to 1666, 1665 and more specifically. In 1665, something happened. Because during that period, they were trying to find a way to build the United States. And the European colonial powers were saying, I sent you whites to America to build America, to use the land, to bring resources, to find gold and silver and products back to Europe. And the colonial powers, contrary to what you read in the history books, they did not come here for religious freedom. They weren't fools. They could have gone any place in Europe and worshiped. There was nothing but woods and bushes and trees over there. They came here specifically to get wealth and resources and gold. And what they kept telling the European colonial powers was that we can't do anything with America because we don't have a labor force. And somebody said, yes, we do have a labor force. So you remember that group back in 1638 that Maryland shut out under the doctrine of exclusion? That's our labor force. So at that point in time, what they did then, they passed what were called enslavement laws. They passed enslavement laws and they took the doctrine of exclusion and expanded it. So that not only did the doctrine of blacks to be excluded, but now blacks were to be excluded, subordinated, non-compensated, non-competitive work group, a labor force for the personal comfort and wealth building of white society. That was what the slave code said explicitly and implicitly. That's been the problem that you've had now for 400 years. It decided how you were to be treated. At those slave codes again. And remember this, on anything that goes on in Los Angeles, you can tell when your policy in effect is blacks will be excluded, subordinated, non-compensated, non-competitive, managed workforce for the personal comfort and wealth building of white society. That stayed in effect until about 1705. 1705, the slave codes were passed. Very important. What the slave codes did was to tell everybody, whites on one side and blacks on one side, how you were to treat black folk and how whites were to behave towards each other. It says that every white person must accept how black folk were to be treated. They must accept the public policy. And that every white institution, every white church, every white business, every white school, every white level of government, and every white individual must treat black folk in an exploited, subordinated, excluded manner. Any white person who deviated from that, he could be hurt and injured and lynched. Even whites could not deviate from that policy. And no white person could raise a black person up to make him equal to a white person. And on the other side of the slave codes, it told how blacks were to be treated. Blacks were not to be permitted to be equated to whites in any respect. A white person could not enter a room without a white person's permission. A black person could not enter a group carrying a conversation without permission. He could not carry a weapon, a tool. He could not raise his hand to defend himself. He could not strike a white person. He could not be called out after dark on certain times, carrying a weapon. And he couldn't even look out, some cases, he couldn't even look out the same window the whites looked out of. That was a subordination. He could never be put in a position of power and authority. Now, those are what the slave codes did. And also the slave codes attached to that was called the Diversity Act of 1705. It says to make sure this thing works, every time you get 6 black folk together, make sure there's 1 white person included. That was to always monitor black folk, to make sure they never did any planning, that they never did anything that could be injurious to them. So by 1710, things really started picking up all over the world. 6 out of every 7 persons coming across the Atlantic were black folk coming to America. 6 out of 7 were blacks. For the first 300 years, coming this way west were blacks. Just in between, show you what they were doing, from 1500 to 1660 as an example, they shipped 5 million black folk out of Africa just to Central America down here to dig for gold and silver. And in 150 years, black folk with tools and sticks and stones, they dug out over 16,000 tons of silver and over 4,000 tons of gold. All that went back to Europe. Black folk at that point in time were producing almost 99% of all the sugar on earth, cotton, tobacco,
I
and
make
everything
this
else.
for
They
you.
were building all the houses, the caulkers, builders. So what they did then, they started advertising in Europe. So anybody wants to get wealth, they go to America. You go to America, we guarantee you. We give you free land and free labor. And you would have to be an idiot to come to America. If we give you free land and free labor, and not get rich. So they began, and by 1710, somebody said, well, how are we going to control all these blacks? So the state of Virginia passed a law called meritorious manumission. Meritorious manumission then says that we will control blacks by building in an internal attitude inside of them to make them see things through our eyes, to make them white in everything but skin color. And what the meritorious manumission was passed by the state of Virginia in 1710 then said we will reward any black who gets very good at this. And so if any black person saves a white person's life, protects a white person's property, invents something that a white person can make money off of, or if he squeals on in the slave revolts, he would get freedom. Okay? And so I tracked from 1710 all the way up to 1860s. And out of over 200 some possible slave revolts, a black person squealed in every one of them. And so following that up, in 1712, there's a guy named Willie Lynch, 2 years later down in Jamaica. He heard about the law, and he came up to Virginia and says, I know how to do it. I can help you set up a system where black folk will never, ever organize and come together again. He says, I got a lot of experience in the islands on treating blacks. And so that's what y'all heard about the Willie Lynch letter. That's what that case. So Willie Lynch came up 2 years later, and they paid Willie Lynch to be a consultant to carry out what was enacted in Virginia in 1710. He says, I would divide blacks along lines of sex, along lines of skin color, along lines of age, tribe, everything. He said, in that way they'd never get organized again. They would never, ever have a community. I would divide them so they'd never have a community that would be functional. And Willie Lynch started that, and as Willie Lynch started that, blacks began to squeal on each other. 100 years later, by 1840, for instance, I had over 6,000 blacks in the United States that were slave owners. 6,000 blacks owned other slaves by 1840. Because as soon as they got free under meritorious manumission, they ran out and tried to be white and hired and bought them some black slaves. And then when you saw tears coming out of my eyes, I just thought about, again, I was thinking about down in New Orleans. down in New Orleans, and blacks down there saying, Dr. Hansel, what can bring us together? And I said, you got a big problem. They said, why? And that's why I had the tears. Let me tell you something. In New Orleans was the epitome of black folk doing in other black folk. On the eve of the Civil War in New Orleans, you had almost approximately 812 free blacks in New Orleans on the eve of the Civil War. 642 owned other black slaves. Then in the Civil War, New Orleans put together 2 full regiments of blacks to fight with the South to keep slavery. And worse than that, one of the biggest revolts, slave revolts, occurred in New Orleans, where blacks tried to break free. And do you know that the free blacks joined the white plantation owners and went and put down the black slave revolt? And the worst part about it, they chopped off all the heads of all the blacks that were revolting and put them on poles leading all the way from Jefferson Parish all the way into the city of New Orleans as a warning against any other blacks trying to get free of the system. And see, that hurts me when I hear about that. And so, you see, you got that meritorious manumission policy saying, keep black folk divided. So between 1712 now and up until the Civil War, some things started happening that's very profound for you all in understanding your racial situation out here. By 1750, black folk peaked out. The population of blacks in America got up to 34%. And then the white society got very scared with that. They said, with that kind of number in this country, there's a possibility that blacks might get together with Indians. So then in every treaty that whites were signing with Indian treaties, they put an incentive in there for the Indians to turn against black folk. They say every time you catch a black, you're to turn him in. And they would pay an Indian $20 on an average to chase down an escaped runaway slave, to track him in the woods and bring him back to his plantation. And because of that, Indians in America allied with the white dominant society. And I keep hearing blacks bragging about the fact how much Indian blood they got. Indians were not your friends in history. They were not your friends. And I don't mean to put the Indians down. Indians got special problems. I'm not putting anybody else down. I'm not going to put the Hispanics down. I'm going to tell you the truth. And out of the 5 civilized tribes in the United States, all five of them sided with the South to keep slavery. In a 20-year period between 1840 and 1860, the biggest killers of blacks in America were Indians. And see, the Indians then, so that's what they were trying to get, that kind of an ally between whites and Indians, so that blacks could not ally with them. And that's why every civilized tribe was a slave trader. Indian tribe was a slave trader and a slave owner. As a matter of fact, in Camp Smith, right not too far from me in Texas, in 1867, in Camp Smith, the Choctaws and the Chickasaws still had slaves even 2 years after the war and wouldn't turn them loose. And the United States government gave them $300,000 to turn black slaves loose, to the Chickasaw and Choctaw Indians, and said, we'll give you $300,000 and take this money and divide it up and turn those black slaves loose and give them some land. And they never, but 2 years later, in 1869, blacks were coming to Washington saying the Indians never gave them anything. And to this day, blacks never got a penny from the Indians. So what I'm saying is everybody has been against blacks because we've never been united. But so when I leave here after today, I want you all to be together, okay? And so by 1750, we hit 34 population. The colonies were scared. So they started petitioning England to quit shipping any more slaves in. And that's what triggered the Revolutionary War. And one of the biggest things was that they were scared that blacks and Indians might somehow get together and take over the country. And so after the war was over, let me get before that. Then the Constitution was written. When the Constitution was written, what they did, they went back and picked up the slave codes I told you about, the slave codes and enslavement laws. That's why in the United States Constitution they classify you as 3/5 of a human being, why they passed the Fugitive Slave Act, and why they condone, slavery. That's why you got locked into that whole system. Because what they did then was give all the power to the slaveholding states in the South. And the first compromise was committed at that time. And what happened then, the wealthy whites in the country says, we will allow people to keep slaves, but we'll always protect poor whites. And so they started a system saying, wealthy whites up here, poor whites here, blacks down there. So even if you're a wealthy white, you'll make sure that poor whites are at least the management class, that they're over the blacks, they're the supervisors. So the blacks go into the ditch, the white will stand over it, the poor white will be over the ditch. If you put a black person on the truck, the white will drive the truck. Okay? That was a commitment that was made that poor whites would always come at least right above blacks. And I'm going to show you how that got into all our national public policies later on. And so between that, that was built into the Constitution. Now they developed a system in this country. I hope my time is on. Is my time running? Okay. So they built into the Constitution, right after the Constitution was initiated, they built the Constitution based on the premise that you're going to have a social democracy. Very important for black folk. A social democracy means that the majority will win, the minority will lose and suffer. But also in the Federalist Papers, it says that the majority then can never do anything to stop the minority from becoming a majority. And it is the majority's responsibility to protect the minority. And as soon as the Constitution was built on that, it was violated next year, 1 year later. Whites in America never accepted that it was their responsibility to protect black folk if you're going to make them a minority. They're talking about black folk shouldn't be out now chasing civil rights as a minority. They know that as a minority you can't win. You don't have the power. It is the majority's responsibility to take care of the minority. Not the minority's responsibility to fight for something you can't get. You don't have the power. And that was violated because in 1790, the first act of the Congress, right after the country was organized with the Constitution, the first law says this is a white country and the quota on black folk is 0. Which means you got a 0 quota, you can only come into this country as a slave. At that moment, black people became the only permanently planned minority in the country. You become the only planned loser. Remember, the minority means loser. Anytime you use the word minority, you call yourself a loser. Don't ever use that word. Okay? You call yourself a loser. So their first act of Congress was to pass an act saying it's a white nation, got a 0 quota on blacks except for slaves. Nobody else you see in that minority category is there a law on you. Nobody says how many women you can have, how many gays you can have, how many handicapped, how many veterans you can have. Only blacks. That's why you cannot get Haitians into the country, because you got a 0 quota. That quota was changed in 1966 and raised to 1/2 of 1%, where you got a few can drift in from the Caribbean, but they know you can't compete because you got 2 million Hispanics coming in every year. And that's why you're going to get suffocated to death. As a matter of fact, jumping ahead of myself for a second to show you what I mean by the influx and how they're going to suffocate you. In 1840s, you did not have one single Asian or Hispanic in the entire United States. But you had 5 million black folk that were enslaved. 5 million black folk were enslaved, but you did not have one Asian and one Hispanic. By the Civil War, you had 6,000 Hispanics. By 1900, you had 100,000 Hispanics. You had 100,000 Hispanics in 1900, but you got 11 million blacks. And they got the same identical birth rate. Here are blacks, here are Hispanics. Here are blacks, here are Hispanics. They got the same birth rate. Now they're going to pass blacks. You know why? You can't come into the country and fight and protect yourself by numbers. You are a permanent loser. And that's why you're going to be overwhelmed in this area. You cannot win if they can't let you get your population up. And the major issue they're going to fight for is keeping the doors of immigration open so they can become the dominant population over you. They know you cannot bring in your people. And that's why you had 3,000 blacks on a boat off the west coast of Liberia, Africa, for about 2.5 months, and nobody even called them in. They were sick and hungry. No country would take them in. The United States has never had an immigration policy for black folk to bring in blacks, because they want you to stay in a minority category and loser category. And so what we're going to be talking about when we talk about solutions in a little while is that the only way you win is that you got to learn that when you accidentally become the majority, you immediately start acting like the majority. Get out of the minority category. Don't ever let anybody call you a minority. If they're going to call you anything, make them call you the only non-immigrants in America. Okay? Every public policy that you develop, every program that you develop it for non-immigrants. When you develop it for non-immigrants, you get into a special category with just black folk. You immediately, that word non-immigrant reconnects you with your history. It reconnects you with how you got here. It reconnects you with your culture and your past. Right now you have no past and no culture, no future. And the other thing it does when you start using the word non-immigrant is that you jump ahead of all the other groups. As immigrant takes on a negative, you say, hey, I'm not an immigrant, I'm a non-immigrant. And what you also do, you stop whites from bragging about my daddy came from Poland, my daddy came from Germany. You stop them from doing that by saying, hey, you're an immigrant then. I was here before you. See, 97% of all the black people in the United States were here before 97% of all other people here are even arrived today. Remember that. Very important. When somebody starts telling you to go back where you came from, you say, hey, 97% of my people here before y'all ever arrived. And so if anybody's going to leave, the last leave first. And the people who developed everything should stay here, because everybody else got a free ride. So let me tell you what happened between 1710 and 1712 and the Civil War. Let me show you what blacks did in terms of accumulating the wealth. Nobody else accumulated the wealth. The wealth was in black slaves. They keep flipping things over, tricking my people, for making you believe that somebody worked hard and that they got their money from land. They did not get their money from land. Land had no value. Land had absolutely no value. You could get all the free land you wanted in America. They had head rights and land grants. They gave out millions of acres of land whoever wanted. You could go in the United States and go out to what we call the frontier, where Indians were, and say, I own from here to that mountain, drive a stick in the ground.